So
the packet has a warning label, yes.
Oh.
Well, having heard all that sort of fuzzy stuff, my favourite definition of a professor, which is what I am, is a professor is someone who talks in someone else's sleep. So feel free. I mean, you're probably very tired. I'm not using my bed, it's the one at the bottom end there. But that's W.H. Auden, by the way. You do need to know that I have one wife who has been struggling to make me affable now for somewhat over 50 years. 4 natural children and 1 that we picked up in the streets of Bukavu. Between them, they've given us 22 grandchildren so far. My oldest daughter is a missionary in Malawi. We're a crazy family. She's with Iris Ministries. David's totally charismatic and, you know, waves his hands in the air and that stuff, which I don't do. But they have been picking up street children in Malawi for the last 17 years. So I actually have 200 black grandchildren legally. I don't actually know their names. I have 22 natural grandchildren whose names I try to remember. They're doing well. We have been very blessed, but we are not a model for anyone else. The only text in the Bible that describes our marriage is iron sharpens iron. Sparks fly, but they are usually productive. My wife makes me do things, otherwise I would never have left the library or the laboratory. So all you really need to know about me is I'm not a model of how to do anything, but probably how not to do things. I grew up in a blue-collar environment in Birmingham, the British equivalent of Detroit, which was a very different city in the 1940s because that's how long ago and longer that I was born. Blue-collar environment, grandfather on one side a Marxist trade union leader and on the other side a drunken coppersmith, so it was hardly a good start. But my parents both became Christian when they were teenagers. My mother in particular had an interesting conversion, which played out in my life. I didn't really see its fruition until I was in my 40s. But my grandfather, the Marxist, was a just man. He wanted no favourites in the family, and since you can't equalise upwards, the problem with equality as a virtue, as a political end, is that you can only go downwards, you can't go upwards. So an equal society will be dumb. And that's what he did to my mother in a way. She could have gone on with her education, but he didn't allow her to. So age 13 or so, she was working as a seamstress in Birmingham. Way beneath her talents, except of course she made all her own clothes and everybody else's, and she didn't need such silly things as patterns. She could just look at something and make it. But fortunately she sat next to a Christian woman who was smart, didn't try to evangelize her. More of that later, perhaps. She loved her. She realized she was a very unhappy teenager. But when she'd earned her brownie point, she said one week to her, "We've got some interesting missionaries in our church this week. Would you like to come and listen to them? They've been in the Congo for 20 years without a salary." That is as far away from Marxism as you can get. No material base for living there, and God had never let them down, of course. They'd gone with C.T. Studd, actually. Some of you may know that name. It's a pity you don't know the missionary greats anymore. And it's a faith mission. You pray for everything. So they spent 3 hours a day in prayer. And they came home on furlough, you know, once every 5 to 10 years. And they had decided that God wanted them in the Ituri forest for life, so they didn't have a family. But they took young people who became Christian when they were in England as children in the Lord. And my mom went the first night and her jaw dropped, and by the 3rd night she became Christian. Now she had someone to write to. She was smart. I didn't know quite how smart for a long while. But letters went backwards and forwards. In those days the mail got to the Ituri forest. It doesn't anymore, but it did then. Well, it took 6 weeks each way. So they knew when she got engaged, when she got married, and when I was conceived. And from the day they heard that I had been conceived, they prayed for me every day for the next 30 years until they died. And they prayed that I would become a doctor, I would become a Christian, I would become a doctor, and I would go to the Belgian Congo. Nobody told me that. It was 40 years later when, because of the career I'd had, which is not tonight's topic, but sufficient to say that I was privileged to be part of the trio of guys who wrote the definitive protocols for the treatment of severe malnutrition forever. We didn't know that at the time, but that's true. So that when I left Jamaica after spending 7 years there in the best job in the world, we went through 100 10-pound 2-year-olds and saved every single one. When American pediatricians arrive in a famine now, the death rate doubles, still to this day, because the proper treatment of severe malnutrition is so counterintuitive, you would not dream of doing it that way. It's not in an American textbook yet, and that's over 30 years. You're very parochial, I'm afraid. You have to go to the Oxford textbook of medicine if you want to find a decent description. If you can't find that, you can email me. My wife keeps one on the computer, and she'd send it to you. But we then went back. I was supposed to have an academic job in London, which had been kept for me for 5 years, but then Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, and the first act of her government was to abolish my job. The trust that was paying my salary were embarrassed. There was no risk to me. I mean, they said, we're very sorry about this. We think she'll reinstate it. I thought, no way. But they said, we'll pay you to get a job. It won't take long. And it didn't. And we ended up in North America. We couldn't find a nice church that we liked. So we went to the nearest one. I call it the most loving and the most ignorant church I've ever been in. But they would sit under a picture of John Wesley and say, become a Christian now. How historically ignorant can you be? Anyway, but they were nice people. But some missionaries came, and they were, of course, from the Belgian Congo. They learned, my wife, being hospitable, brought them home to lunch, and they discovered very quickly that I knew as much about the treatment of severe malnutrition as anyone in the world at that point. And they said, well, you have to come and help us. We have a huge problem. I asked them how big. And they told me, I said, no, you don't. You're not making the measurements right. And they said, well, come and sort it out for us. And I said, well, in principle, yes, and under my breath, in practice, no. I got an ambitious program ahead of me in my lab, but God had other plans. My family said, you're due a sabbatical, we're all coming. And I had a family war on my hands. I put about 6 barriers in the way, and they were systematically removed. I won't go through them, but the last one was funny. I gave a lecture on the treatment of severe malnutrition in the University of Toronto, sick kids. And after the lecture, a very black man came up to me and said, do you ever go to Nairobi? And I said, I'm trying not to, why? And he said, well, I'm the professor of pediatrics there. I would love our students to hear that lecture. And I said, I've got a party of 10 now, and I'm going to have to sell my car before I go anyway, so that I don't go into debt while I'm there. But I have to get through Nairobi as quickly as possible to keep the hotel bills in check. And he said, no, you don't. If you'll give some lectures, I can give you a house for free for as long as you want it in Nairobi. The university has one. At which point I gave in. I used to talk to my dad on Sunday afternoon, and I called him and said, Dad, you'd be interested to know that my mother had died of Alzheimer's by this stage. That Sally and I and the children are going to what was the Belgian Congo for a year next year. And there was a silence on the other end of the phone, and then I said, you all right? He said, yes, but John, I've waited 45 years to hear you say that. Very patient man. I don't think we're patient enough sometimes, especially with evangelism. And I think I wasn't going to say this, but I will, because when I come south, sometimes I think you're a bit too aggressive. And you take too much ownership of conversion. I had the lovely experience a couple of years ago of a man that I've been friends with for 25 years finally become Christian. I prayed for him regularly throughout that process. He's an extremely smart man. He's probably one of the best conservative journalists in North America. His name is John Robson. I met him over 25 years ago, actually, because he came as a journalist to cover a lecture I was giving in Ottawa called Why Are There No Hittites on the Streets of New York? And after the lecture, as he came out, he said, "The only Christian journalist I know in Ottawa." I actually enjoyed that lecture. I didn't expect to. And she said, "Would you like to meet him?" And he said, "Yes, as long as he doesn't know that. I'll arrange that." And she did. And we became friends. He's an atheist, trilingual, PhD in history. I'm not an atheist, and I'm not trilingual anymore. And but we both loved arguing. And so we met every couple of months or so. And then, after about 5 years of this, I bought the paper on the Ottawa paper on Saturday morning, which I don't normally do. It must have been an act of God, because John had written an opinion piece, which I have copies of still. The title was, "Why Taking the Cross Seriously Can Make You Very Cross." Lovely play on words. And he said, "The ancient Mediterranean at the time of Christ was not an ignorant backwater, but where Greek learning, Roman pragmatism and Jewish theology met, some fishermen, a tax collector, and a man who had a seizure on the road to Damascus persuaded their neighbours and then the whole Roman Empire that a dead Jewish carpenter was God." How weird is that? And this God didn't prance around in power, wielding a big sword, but he allowed his creatures to nail him to a stick on a dunghill, and that changed the history of the world. How weird is that? He said, by now, he'd read the whole of Lewis by this stage. I'd got that much done. And he said, if I as an atheist am honest, I have to admit that after the New Testament, people like Augustine and Aquinas and Bonaventure, right down to C.S. Lewis, were not stupid. And they took the scriptures seriously. And I have to admit that when the wild Norsemen met the Irish monks won the argument. Mm-hmm. And if I'm going to be an honest atheist, I have to read the scriptures. But if I do, I'm mortally afraid the monk will win the argument. I sent him an email immediately. I said, "John, I wish I'd written that." That came an immediate answer. You wrote one sentence. "But you promised me you'd be around for me when I needed to talk. I think I need to talk." Back with an email, "I think you do. But you've chosen a bad time. The cook's away. We'll have to go to the pub." So he turned up from his karate class. He's also a black belt. And I said, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Well, I'm not an atheist anymore. I believe it makes more sense that there's a mind behind the universe than that there isn't a mind behind the universe. So I guess I'm a theist. But what do I do with Jesus?" Now, I know what you guys would do, but I didn't do that. I said, "You don't expect me to answer that question, do you? This is far too much fun to watch." And I said, "You've said what you have to do it." It took another 5 years, and then we didn't meet so often. He got himself a live-in girlfriend, and when she met me, she thought I was dangerous. So she was a Marxist. And she'd had an awful father. I mean, that's a terrible burden to bear. But we met occasionally. But then I got another request. He said, "My girlfriend and I both now believe that there is a God. We don't yet believe in Jesus. Can you find a priest to marry us?" I said, "Yeah, I can do that." I did. His wife, the priest, and himself, and a guy dragged in off the street were the only people at the wedding. But they got married. And then nothing happened for a while. But I run a program in the summer which teaches the history of ideas with a medical slant, so you can get CME credits. I've been doing it for 20 years with some other guys. We were getting to the stage in intellectual history where Magna Carta comes up, and John had a great interest in that. So I asked him, "Would you come and talk to my docs?" And he came. And I asked him, "How do I introduce you?" He said, "No change," so I didn't say anything about that. He did a wonderful job. The guys loved him. He's a marvellous speaker. A couple of years later, we were a bit of his history that he again knew, and that was 2 years ago now. And I said, "This year?" He said, "It's time I came out. I'm a Christian now." And he doesn't know exactly when it happened. I knew it was happening by watching his columns in the newspaper. I could see the change. That's a real conversion. Do you become a Christian when you sign a set of boxes and tick them. I believe in God. I believe that Jesus died for our sins. I've asked him into my life. Sign here, you're a Christian. Does that make you a Christian? If you think it is, you won't get through medical school on that basis. You'll see where I'm going with this in a moment. That's a reductive way of looking at faith, and it's not true. Most of us can't give an adequate explanation of how we became Christian. We know that we are when it's happened. We don't know how it happens. That's something God does. Amen. And I don't want to interfere in that. I say that our culture is thinking where it should feel and feeling where it should think. We think Romans 12:2 reads, if you've understood what I'm teaching you, you ought to be transformed by the renewal of your feelings. But Paul doesn't say that. It's the renewal of your mind. You have no control over your feelings. You have control of what you do with them, but where they come from, whither they go, you do not know. They're God's province. He can make you feel happy in the saddest place on earth. He's done that to me. No, subjectivity is a wonderful human characteristic, but you don't rely on it. And certainly your conversion will have subjective aspects. You know you're different. You can feel the difference, but you can't give an explanation. Of course, Jesus teaches that, doesn't he? Think of the story of Nicodemus. Nicodemus was, in our terms, a professor. And professors are amongst the most catty, envious, devious, nasty people on earth. And he was a nicer version of it, but he'd been watching Jesus teach, and what do you think his response was? It was envy. He knew that Jesus taught with an authority he didn't have. That's what he wanted. That's what he came for. Jesus knew that. So he gave him one of the greatest non-answers of all time. He basically said to him, as though he was an Irishman, you can't get to where you want to go from where you are now. And you can't. The first thing he said was, until you are born of the Spirit, you cannot see, you cannot comprehend the kingdom of heaven. It's not something that's a human possibility. He does promise if you seek, you'll find, but you don't know when. And the more educated you are, the longer it takes, almost invariably. Down syndrome gets there very quickly. They're lovely. I stayed with one last night. They're wonderful. World's best greeters, I call them. Because I ran a clinic for severely handicapped children for the last 2 or 3 years of my clinical career. And I was the patient, not them. They taught me far more than I taught them. But what we don't do now is think. We have young people like you who are Christian. Could any of you honestly say that the last Christian book you read was as demanding as the worst of your technical books you read? The answer is no, isn't it? You put your effort into what is of transient importance, merely temporal importance, and you don't put any effort into learning how to read the scriptures. Now, I changed my teaching methods as a professor, in the early 90s, or early 90s. And the reason was interesting. I was invigilating the Christmas exam in the gym with hundreds of students there of various classes. And about 5 minutes or 10 minutes into the exam, I got a note given to me by the porter, and it said, we've received a bomb scare, that there is a bomb hidden in this building. So you have to take it seriously. The timing was very suspicious, but there's nothing to do. So I got their attention and said, leave your paper on the table, pick up your bag and your coat and go for a 20-minute walk. There's been a bomb scare. Leave quietly. There's no risk, I'm sure. And go for a walk. I went for a walk too. I should have noticed they left very quietly. Nobody was really appeared to be at all worried by it. I thought about that more later, but I got to the end of the parking lot, and there was a group of students gathered around the back of a pickup, and one said to the other, you idiot, you were supposed to memorize the third question. It was obvious who was at least involved in this scam. It was an engineer. They work out how to do things, not whether you should do them. I told the guy, and he said, I'm not resetting the exam, so they got away with it. Then I realized, how would I know whether my students were involved in that? And the answer was, I wouldn't. So that upset me. I said, there's no way my fourth year honours biochemistry class is going to be used as a stepping stone to medical school, for instance, by cheating. So what can I do about it? In the end, I realised the only thing I could do was making cheating of no value. So I taught a fourth year honours biochemistry class with no requirement for memorisation at all. My exam lasted 8 hours. And I taught them how to read, because you don't know how to read. And I'll prove that to you, because you think I'm insulting you. I'm not, I'm merely being descriptive. Being Christian, does anybody here deny having read Ephesians at least 10 times in your life? Perhaps one can escape. So one might escape the judgment, but the rest...
10?
10?
I don't mean that.
You've not heard it read 10 times, Ephesians? In church? You don't go to church? So you didn't even know that it was being read to you?
I'm only like 3 years old in the faith. So.
Oh yeah, okay, well, you should have heard it that many times by now anyway. But the rest, you see, have not moved. Now, the next question, stand up and give me the argument of the first 2 chapters of Ephesians. None of you are willing, right? You can't do it. In other words, you've never learned to read. Now, the way that I proved that to the students, and I could do it with you, is I would give them a paper at a level that they should understand, and then I would run quickly over the biochemistry involved and say, now, go home and write me a précis of this paper, and I want it back in 2 days so that I can read it before the next session. Nobody asked me what a précis was, and I knew none of them knew what it was. And they were used to getting 80% at least as a mark. So their first learning was coming up very acutely. Nobody got a mark over 50%. You imagine, you know what that class felt like at that moment. And I said, well, lesson 1 is intellectual pride has no place in real learning, and certainly has no place at all near the bedside. You did not know what a précis was. You wrote a summary, which is not the same thing. You deserve the mark you've got. But I'm merciful. I will delete these marks and we'll start again from there. And I taught them how to write a précis properly. And they all learned how to do it. If you ever do a PhD, most PhD students think when they've got their data, they're halfway through their PhD. That's not true. You do much better to write a précis of the dozen or so major papers that will underlie your thesis. A careful one, a good one. It'll take you a couple of months to do 12 papers that way. But you will then have written your introduction. When you write a précis, it's the French word for precise, without the terminal E, an accent grave on the first E. In the Middle Ages, professors were more honest than they are now. I'm not interested in your original thoughts. You're not old enough to have useful original thoughts. And they knew that in the Middle Ages. What you wanted, if you wanted a master's, they would give you a book that everybody knew was important, but difficult. And you had to write a shortened version of that book without missing anything important out and show that you understood it. Now that's an exercise that's really worth learning to do. And when you write a précis, that's what you do. Now when I went to high school, from my blue-collar background, translated to an amazing school, one of the best schools in England intellectually, I found within a few months I was being asked to write précis in 3 different languages. I didn't know that was unusual because I'd never been to high school before. I thought that's what all high schools were like. Of course they're not. That's a wonderful training. So when you really understand a passage, when you've done that, you don't need notes to deal with it. Because you don't remember it, you know it, and that's quite different. And you also learn a lot about quality. So you remove all adverbs and adjectives. They're never important to an argument. You're writing something ugly. You're wanting to get at the structure of the passage or the text. So you remove, if it's a building, you'd have to remove all the pretty bits to get down to see what bears the weight. And then you could put things back together again. You would understand how the building stands up. You do the same with a text. make all complex sentence simple. I mean, Paul is on a rhetorical high. That's why I choose Ephesians. I really feel sorry for the guy who had to take it down. I hope to meet him one day and ask him what it was like. I mean, Paul is on cloud nine, but he doesn't lose his mind. There's a structure underneath it. When you see it, bang, 3 points, conclusion, next bit. It's all there, and you never forget it after that. So try it for yourself. Even better, you can read a passage and then write a précis without looking at the passage again. And the most important thing you'll notice is what you missed out. For instance, if you took John 13, the washing of the disciples' feet, how does that chapter open? Now, even you have probably read it at least once, right? You don't know. And it's very much about what you're in the midst of now, knowledge. Jesus knew everything. He knew what was going to happen. So what did he do? He washed the disciples' feet. You call me Master and Lord, and you are right to do so. If I then, your Master and Lord, wash your feet when I know everything, what ought you to do? Message taken, right? So, I had a very good education, in other words, and I didn't give credit where I should. I went to medical school, and I was privileged. The first Sunday in London, another student took me to hear Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And so I listened to him for most of 5 years. He preached 3 sermons a week. One on Friday night, which was a Bible reading. In 5 years, he got through 1 chapter of Romans, and it was never boring. Sunday morning was directed at discipleship, and Sunday evening at evangelism. I still remember some of those sermons. When I got bored with him, I could go and listen to John Stott. You know, we were privileged. We didn't know it. Unlike, where's Ron gone to hide? Yeah. When he was saying how nice you are, you smile and you have nice eyes, etc. I'm not like that. From a very early age, I was allergic to evangelical smiles. I think they're untrue, especially in America. I remember once having been to Focus on the Family, much against my will, but in fact I had to repent. Because I thought they were a bunch of old fascists when I set out, but they weren't. Close, but not quite. But we were sitting in the airport at Colorado Springs, waiting to come back. They, unlike most Christian organizations, want you to bring your wife, and they pay for her as well. And I said to Sally, all these women are not smiling at me. She said, of course they're not. She said, no, I don't mean that. They are not smiling at me. They've had bad plastic surgery and it's tightened up. They smile whether they like it or not, even when they're asleep. Those are American smiles. They're artificial. The real thing is much better, you know, a little. I much prefer an ironic acknowledgement of humour than a real smile. So I didn't go to evangelical student things unless there was someone like Martin Lloyd-Jones speaking. I was part of a Bible study. Because I like scriptures. 40 years later, I could only think of 2 people who went to that Bible study who were still practicing the faith. What's the probability that you will have an active faith at the end of residency? What would your guess be?
100% God will.
What?
God will not lose one of what he has called.
That is true. That wasn't the question I asked, though.
Is it 15?
The question I asked is, what is the probability that you will have an active faith? Fortunately, God does hold on to us, but we have some duties too, and there are consequences upon our behavior. What's the likelihood? What are you guessing? Just come up with a number.
Guess of 15 coming from the
15 over there. That's particularly pessimistic, but it's it's certainly of the order of 20%. Yeah, you're much more likely not to be practicing at the end of the next 10 years than you are now. That certainly happened to me, and I took 20 years to recover. And what I do now is penance for my misdeeds in the past. And You can ask me about my misdeeds as we go along. It's longer than you wanted, but you can ask a question if you want. 1 hour lecture. How long are the questions?
Let's go with 4.5.
Nearly 5. Where? Russia. The worse it gets, the longer the question period. So, Bible Belt, 20 minutes.
Okay, the first one. There was a law passed recently in the state of New York allowing late-term abortions. In light of this, what actions should a Christian take that's working for a healthcare facility where the practice of abortion is actively occurring? Biblically, should the Christian remove themselves from association with a hospital that permits to abort, especially late-term abortion, or can a Christian still honor God in their medical position at a hospital approving of this? So where do we draw the line?
Yeah. It's very near to the bone for me because I was pro-choice for 20 years.
Oh.
Before abortion was legal. The reason was when I was doing infectious diseases in London in the early 60s, we didn't have a rubella vaccine. And every now and again a woman would come with a rash who was pregnant. They knew that this could be bad. And they'd say, is this rubella? They'd say, is it German measles? And I'd say, well, there are many viruses that will produce that kind of rash. So we need to take some blood today and some more blood in a week's time, and I'll see you a day or so after that, and we'll discuss it. Now, the rubella syndrome is horrendous. Serious cardiac and neurological problems in a good percentage of cases if you get the infection at the time when you're vulnerable. Fortunately, in most cases, it was either not that virus or it was the dates were otherwise, but every now and again. Now, what we were taught to say, and what I said was, this pregnancy's gone wrong, hasn't it? And how many women would disagree if you said your pregnancy is going to produce a child with major brain damage and cardiac damage too? They all agreed. Would you like to start again? You all said yes. I said, we can make that happen. You'll have to come into hospital briefly and then you can start again. We never used the word abortion. And I facilitated that, I arranged it. And I felt no guilt, note the verb. I didn't think about it. I'd already bought into the idea that we were problem solvers. This solved the problem, didn't it? I didn't think about it again for 20 years. Monday after, in a week's time, I will be lecturing on abortion in Wayne State Medical School in the middle of the day. I've gone the full circle. They were the first people to ask me to do it actually as well, so wow. It's back after I've done it. I've done it now 50 or 60 times at least, from Wayne State where it started, you name it, Oxford, Sydney, Los Angeles, Harvard, Wisconsin, yeah. And never had an aggressive question at the end of the lecture. It ends in dead silence every time. So what I would do, in the long run, you should say no. I'm not going to do it, but you don't go about it that way. You're going to be asked to do lots of things unless there's a revival or some growth of faith in the society as a whole over the next few years. Euthanasia will certainly come along. Eugenics is on its way. All the things that we can do that are wrong in this direction are natural to a fallen world. So your first line of defense while you're in a junior position is when you're asked to do anything like that, you say, may I ask you a question before I obey you? And every mentor has to say, of course you can ask a question. And the question is, do you wish your family to be cared for by a doctor with or without moral integrity? Who wants a doctor without moral integrity? No one. Not Obama, who wouldn't give any conscience rights to doctors in Obamacare, the biggest defect in the whole thing. They all want a doctor with moral integrity. But of course they don't agree what it is. And so the next thing is, obviously doing this is not a problem of moral integrity to you, but it is to me. If you make me do this, which you have the power to do, unless I'm very strong-willed and willing to be sacrificed, you will diminish me as a person for the rest of my life. You will have made me a lesser person than I could have been. Do you want to do that? How many people will say yes at that point? No one. If they do, you could go to the administration and say this person is unethical. You have plenty of people on your side of the account. You need to get it organised in a better way. So the first thing to do is to start organising it. Right. Now, when you talk about abortion or any of these difficult issues, it's the usual thing. We go straight for the problem that's right there without ever thinking about what it presupposes. How did we get to this position? That's the whole of the Endarkenment project. I refuse to call it enlightenment. It wasn't. It was an Endarkenment. And it never talks about, in the beginning, what? It doesn't start the argument at the beginning. So the way that I will do it in a week's time, I do it every time because it works. I can ask you, you imagine you're the whole class. I say, if I was to say to you, although you've only been in medical school a little while, in some cases a few months and some a year or two, but if I was to say to you that within a few weeks of getting to medical school, you decided there were people in your class to whom you would never trust the care of a dog of yours, what would you say? Now, you're all a bit solemn, but what do you think happens in your class? Yeah, there's a little wisp, isn't there, of recognition. The answer is yes, isn't it? And normally you can see it, but you are all being prissy about it. Yeah, you know that, within weeks. And I say, well, yeah, they're not here today, are they? Because they're not immoral, they're amoral. They're not properly formed. And that's increasingly the case. People who haven't had a serious conversation in their lives certainly not have parents who hold their nose to the grindstone and say, what you've just done is wrong. Parents don't even have the confidence to say that anymore. So then I go on and say, now, if I take out issues of life and death and sexuality, do you trust your colleagues, the ones who are here, to practice ethical medicine? And hopefully the answer is yes. But when you put back in sexuality and life and death, is there any possibility of agreement in your class? None. You're split. And the selection process is biased in favour of pro-choice. By the time you get to the end of residency, they have trouble finding abortionists. Because you see, and you experience, and you change. And they know, those senior ones know that that's what's going to happen, and it's very upsetting to them because it's an attack on their understanding of the world. So, all of you in the class, apart from the amoral ones, think that you're practicing ethical medicine. So the real question is not abortion at all. Abortion is merely a symptom. Euthanasia is merely a symptom. The real question is, what would you need to believe to think that abortion is ethical, and what would you need to believe to think that it isn't? We don't even have a shared moral rationality. And the rationality we have determines what ideas we have of justice and duty. And they're not the same. There's no longer an American society. There are collections of Americans who live together for economic benefit, but you have no moral agreement. Nobody in the Western world does. So the best definition of community that I've ever found was by, God uses strange people to get to work on me, and this is a radical atheistic, predatory homosexual professor from Chicago, who nevertheless understood what was at stake. And he said at the end of the first chapter of The Closing of the American Mind, when he's looking at his family history, his grandparents, serious Jews, his parents more materialistic, and he and his cousins all MDs and PhDs. But he's honest enough to say, my grandparents were the ones whose families had wisdom in them. And he said, although they were humble people who never went to university, they could go to the synagogue where they heard great teachers who spake not from an alien perspective, But from the same perspective, but merely going deeper and providing guidance, that, says Alan Bloom, is what a community is. Something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. Even in church, we don't have a common story of meaning because many of you are biblically illiterate to an alarming degree. You don't know your Bibles. And if you don't believe me, there isn't time to test you now, but you can go on my website, and there's a very upsetting test. There's a green button on the first page. I think, well, extreme left. There's one on book list. I can't remember which is the green button. But you will see there is a test of biblical literacy. And the way it works is this. It was written in church many years ago because the pastor misunderstood a passage. And I thought, that's interesting. He quoted a piece of literature which was actually biblical at root, and he didn't recognize the connection. And I thought, that's interesting. And by the end of I don't remember the sermon, but by the end of the sermon, I'd got 50 of these phrases that I had thought of from English literature, which you cannot understand if you do not know the Bible thoroughly. My favourite one, how many of you have seen Kenneth Branagh's Dunkirk? One or two. It's got a marvellous ending on the beach, right? But they missed the ending that it should have been. The last telegram sent from the beach was brilliant. It was 3 words, but if not. Wasn't coded, sent to London and immediately understood. Raise your hand if you know what it means. Good. But your hair is probably grey underneath because that's too much wisdom for one.
They should know it.
Do they know it? So you've heard me do it before. You do actually know it. It goes like this. Be it known unto you, King Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to save us from the fiery furnace, but if not, we will not bend the knee. Isn't that magnificent? Even more magnificent, immediately understood in London. Why? Because when I went to school, every day in public school, a chapter of the Bible was read first for 12 years. That meant at the end of public school, whether you wanted to or not, you were biblically literate because that was peak memorization time. The most stupid thing that's been done in education on this continent is to remove the Bible from school. It should have been kept, not for religious reasons, but for cultural reasons. We are what we are because of the story we inhabited. And to pretend that it could be otherwise, you need some evidence, and they have none. Now, there's about 50 of these there. There are even people in your class probably who wouldn't understand truly the sentence, if you take that job, it will be a crown of thorns. There are university students who don't know any of the gospel. That means we've lost our way. Because the narrative that you inhabit determines your future. The most striking example of this, of course, is the Jews. The Jews win a good percentage, over 30% every time, of the Hard Nobel Prizes every year. Not the silly ones like peace. I mean, you give those to Al Gore. But no, the real ones like medicine and biochemistry and physics, you know. Why? Now, if you ask an Orthodox Jew, he'll tell you why. And he will send you to Deuteronomy 6. How many people know what Deuteronomy 6 contains? Yeah, one. You must be homeschooling. Yes. But let's see how good you are. It's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. What comes next?
These words, as I'm commanding you today, shall be out of your heart. You shall teach them to your sons.
Yeah. Most people say, and your neighbour is yourself. How many people were actually thinking, and your neighbour is yourself? You mean you weren't thinking at all? You certainly weren't thinking the right answer, I know that. You know, when somebody asks a question in public and you don't know the answer, have a go. Because it's 100% learning experience.
Amen.
You get it wrong in front of 400 people, you'll never forget it again.
Yep, he's right.
They've all forgotten in 20 seconds. You'll remember it for the rest of your life. But it's real learning. Take it. Don't turn it down. In fact, if you have something you have real difficulty understanding, get someone like me to ask you in front of a big class. You'll never forget again. I wouldn't charge a lot. No. But he has a bit more attached to it. Let's push you a little further. A little later in the chapter, he tells you how that works out. What is it?
Teach them to. Teach them to your
I mean,
children.
he talks about when you're going to teach them, like when you sit in your house, when you walk.
Yeah, well, but later than that.
Matt, speak up.
No, I said the same thing.
He says, when your son asks you why we go to church,
Yeah.
so to speak,
Mhm.
don't give him a lecture. Tell him the story. We were slaves in Egypt. God rescued us, brought us through the desert into the promised land. Shouldn't we worship a God like that?
Yes.
Up to the age of 7, children are honest. They'll say yes. After 7, they've learned from you to rationalize their desires, and it's over. You've got 7 years to get the stories in place. And what they do, of course, is teach you, give you a moral reference bank. No other cultural story in the world does what the Jews do. They don't tart up their heroes. They tell the truth. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. It's 10 to 1 on for a Jew that you're trying to cheat me. That's a realistic approach. I mean, Robin Hood was a thug. We've turned him into, some kind of idle saint. You do the same with yours. It's only 300 years and you're already telling lies about who they were. My favourite example is, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I was in Carolinas. I can't remember, it was north, I think. And there's an Anglican group there built a very nice neo-Gothic church they're very proud of. And they took me around and walked around. I always look at more than I should, and I went down looking at the windows, and there was St. Augustine, and right next to him, Robert E. Lee. I've never seen Robert E. Lee next to Augustine anywhere else in the world. I don't think he deserves to be there. That's starting up your heroes, no, tell the truth, So Jewish stories, even you can teach your children the one about the Levite chopping up his concubine and sending the bits around Israel and starting a war. Because a child's security doesn't depend on the story. It's just silly liberals who think that. They just say, wow, as long as you're there, they're quite secure. Reality isn't the same for a child at that stage. They're moral beings. That's one of the most lovely things about them. I have all these grandchildren. And I love collecting their first serious comment. My favourite one is not fair. They say that before they've got a full sentence. They come into this world hardwired with a sense of justice. It's not a social construction. It's a gift of God. And you can prove it. Even Chomsky at MIT has accepted that now. He says, look, let's be honest about it. We come into this world with a fully formed language which we don't subsequently speak. It's underneath all languages, and it's moral. There's nothing like it in the animal kingdom. They're just a bunch of reflexes, and therefore they're infallible. They do nothing wrong because the category of wrong and right doesn't exist for an animal. They don't love you. Your dog doesn't love you. You're the source of food, and he's conditioned to know what brings your food from you to him, See, we are in such trouble. I don't know how I got to there, but...
Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
So,
Yeah.
just to come back to it, you have got to learn to talk about what you're being asked to do in a historical way.
Yes.
You've got to know how we got to this point and be able to take them through their arguments so that they feel embarrassed. You've got to embarrass them. Now, if you can't do it, come and do our 8-month course at Augustine College. Or you can do it in Ottawa if you're tough and you can take the winters. Or we're starting one at Virginia Tech next September. And for their first year, they're doing a crazy thing, but they've got some money. They're offering a 2-for-1 deal. So if one of you goes and can take a friend, you can get both of you to do the course for the price of one. That's a 1-year thing to get started. But we started doing this in Ottawa 20 years ago because we're all senior professors who started the program. and we had watched something that's probably happened to some of you already, although I don't expect you to admit this openly. Kids come from good Christian homes to university and then lose their mind, their faith, and their virginity in random order in the first term, in many cases. That's not a good outcome. And going to Bible school actually makes it worse, because they come quoting scripture naively, which makes them totally vulnerable to my more malicious colleagues. It is possible to quote scripture in university again, but you must be a little more subtle. No chapter and verse, hello Ron, and paraphrase it. Then they can't put it in Google. They will recognize that it's wiser than they normally come across in university. And they usually say, that was a quotation, wasn't it? Well done, yes it was. Who do you think said it? They usually say Socrates, and I say, well, it was a wise man, but not that one. And I don't tell them, and I'm out of there by the end of the day. So they're forced to take it at face value. And now, because they're biblically illiterate, the scriptures can flow as long as you don't have chapter and verse all the while. That's a habit you need to drop in many ways. You can keep it for study purposes, but not in public. Learn to let it soak into your language. So that's, yes, I don't think the start of that question, is it wrong? Of course it's wrong. Mm-hmm. Can you do it? Of course not. But you can see that other people who believe that there is no God, which is an act of faith, and you go on to say to them, look, there are two faith systems working here. They don't have a corner on rationality. In fact, they are irrational in many ways. Certainly they have a limited rationality. In fact, I love it when every now and again I'll meet somebody in the university circuit. I do about, I suppose 20-25% of the lectures I do are for entirely secular audiences. They're the best in many ways, because you're in trouble and they're in deep trouble. So I'll meet somebody I knew, and they'll see my mugshot in the university and turn up at the lecture just for fun. I'm still recognizable, my hair colour has changed, but they don't have any trouble with finding me. And they say, oh, hi. And I say, hello. I haven't seen you for a while now. I don't go to the meetings where we used to meet. And then the next phrase, if they're British, they'll be straight to the point, the jugular. I used to read your stuff till the mid-90s, the clear implication being that I lost my mind somewhere around the mid-90s. And I say, you think I lost it? Well, what you write now is rubbish, isn't it? And I said, well, I can think I can prove that's wrong. What do you call somebody who's lost their mind?
Crazy.
Crazy. What happens to their life?
Destroyed.
Falls apart, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, you can even ask my wife. She's not on my side, but she'll tell you that life got better after I started taking faith seriously, not worse. So my faith is not irrational, as you would like to believe it to be, but supra-rational. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your thoughts. Mine are higher, said God. There is a supra-rationality. And that's what we get through the work of the Holy Spirit. Your problem is that you have bought a pup. You have accepted the idea that the liberals all believe that there is an enlightenment rationality which everybody can accept, and therefore everybody can make their own choices, and that will lead to obligations and a good society. What's the problem with that? Well, they're lying, aren't they? Everybody knows what good and evil are, and who does it? Virtually none of us. Our problem is not ignorance, which is what the university wants us to believe. Our problem lies with the will. And they don't even know what a will is. Does anyone? We can't explain consciousness. We can't explain conscience. We certainly can't explain the will. It's not reductive. It cannot be reduced to just neurology. So you've got to get better at doing this. Now, the way you do that is by reading better literature. That'll make a difference. How many people here have read some Peter Kraft? Just the older generation. You've never been called
No.
Oh, well, I can't tell how old women are these days. Well done. Yeah.
What was the book you recommended when you went to UT Houston 5 years ago?
It was probably the best things in life. Are you ready? That's where you heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
You're aging very well. Yeah, well, Peter is an interesting man. He's a friend. He knew he wanted to be a philosopher by the time he was 8. And he grew up in a Christian Reform home. So naturally he went to Calvin in the late 50s. And to his horror, he found when he got there that even Calvin was becoming biblically illiterate. And if Calvin was getting biblically illiterate, everyone was. So he finished his undergraduate. He said, thinking about this, he said, when we become illiterate, we need a liturgy, because that's what liturgies were designed for. When we had to deal with illiteracy before, that's what we did. I'm an Anglican for that reason. At least when you've got a good liturgy, it doesn't matter how bad the sermon is, at least you get something you can feed on. If you've only got praise songs, you're in deep, deep trouble as far as I'm concerned, you know. The content is minimal. That's got to change. So he looked at the world's liturgies and he rightly decided that the most scriptural one is the old Anglican one. It's got to be before the feminists got at it. So 1922 or before is worth using. And it is superb. I mean, the opening prayer, I look forward to it. I drive to church on Sunday morning and I need the opening prayer. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. In other words, quit playing games. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit. Because only then can we do the things we need to do. There's not a wasted word in that prayer. And it takes you straight into the absolute need for repentance and confession. Most evangelical churches now do not repent of sin on Sunday morning, do they? And think what that means. How many of you have read Mere Christianity? Can you tell me what it says at the end about repentance? I have to win once, it's the way I do. Can you tell me? Okay, I feel better. Yeah, it's worth coming. He says this: repentance is not something God demands of you that you could forego if you wished. Repentance is simply a description of what coming to God is like. That is powerful. In other words, if you haven't repented on Sunday morning, you haven't come as close to God as he would wish you to. He's there, but he keeps his distance, because nothing that is unrepented can survive in the presence of God. Did anybody in the Bible have a close encounter with God and start singing happy songs? Is that what happens? No. Flat on your face. Then God will lift you up and then you might start singing praises. If I was a pastor, nobody would come to the church because there'd be no songs till after the sermon and after the Lord's Supper. You might have something to sing about by then. But repentance would certainly be up there, front and central. We need a much more serious, rugged faith than we've currently got. Let's try another sentence.
Yeah.
Another question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Has your experience in medicine and study of the human body provided evidence for soul, for whether the human form is best rationalized by creationism, intelligent design, or theistic evolution?
Well, this is a long journey, of course. I was always, how shall I put it? Think for a moment, a la Jordan Peterson, you know. Well, I knew very early on, when I was quite a little boy, 13 or so, that the way that I was being taught in church was really not very good. And I needed to understand it in a better way. It took a long while before I met people who could do that. And certainly one of the big questions is, where did I come from? In the beginning, what is the question the liberal elite never want you to ask. And so you must ask it all the while. Now, there are really only two options, aren't there? In the beginning, materiality exists, but then it wasn't the beginning. You have to have an eternal universe, which is what Aristotle thought. he thought there was no beginning, that matter was eternal. But modern physics doesn't allow that as an option. If you believe the second law of thermodynamics, you know we had a beginning and we'll have an end. It looks like, from that point of view, not in fervent heat, but in fervent cold, if you like, when we're all down to absolute zero, nothing will be moving. You know, it's over, although stuff is still there. Fervent heat will, I think, us take a move in it and ignite one very large atomic explosion that takes the whole thing away. I don't know, but it's not inappropriate to say it looks to me as though mind is more likely to be there beforehand than matter. It's not a stupid idea. One of the two is likely to be true. Isn't it interesting? Nobody complains about physicists talking about the mind behind the universe. It's only Biology 101 that does that. You fail Biology 101 if you talk about design, but they're doing all their research in genetics, right? And when you've got a bit of DNA and you've expressed it in an E. coli and you've got a protein, what do you have to ask next? What does it do? That's teleology. You can't live without it. We always ask, what's it for? Where did it come from? So, yeah, in the beginning, something. And when you decide that it's more likely to be mind than matter, you might as well call it God and be done with. It's not stupid. Now, we're winning this battle. Physics is a lost cause for the liberal elite to a large degree. It's dominated by Christians. They don't say so because they haven't learned how to do apologetics. They remain silent a lot of times, even worse in molecular biology. But molecular biology is the next bit to fall. It's over. It's just a matter of when it will be acknowledged that it's over. I was telling a couple of students who are sitting here, and I'll tell you because it's a lovely story and you can use it. You need to collect stories that are true. Bioethicists make up stories when they've decided what the conclusion should be. That's the wrong way around. That's cheating. That's not the right way to do it. Medicine gives you an opportunity to have real experiences which people will listen to. Everybody knows when you're telling an authentic story. This one's authentic. You would pick it up very quickly. I've been to teach in Cuba many times. Half a dozen times, I think. I don't keep records. Initially, it was the government allowed the Canadian Christian Medical Dental Society to run a medical conference to keep them up to date, to bring them up to date because they were isolated. And I was allowed as well to talk about Christian understanding of medicine. They didn't mind that either. Very quickly, the pastors in the town discovered that I liked doing biblical exposition as well as medicine, and I started teaching them as well. The government pretended that I hadn't done it because they liked the other bit. Then, about the third trip, I think it was, I'd given a lecture on some aspect of medicine. I can't remember what it was. But a gentleman came up to me, and he turned out to be the head of the Department of Marxism and Leninism in the local university. And I said, what on earth are you doing here? And he said, well, the students tell me that you say that Russia collapsed because it rotted from the inside. It became immoral and amoral. And I agree with you, he said. When I realized Russia was going to collapse, I knew that Cuba would be in deep trouble because they bought all our sugar. And they've been very impoverished ever since. And he said, so I stopped teaching Marxism and Leninism, and I tried to teach multicultural ethics. But the trouble is they go to sleep. But they tell me they don't go to sleep when you teach ethics. So I want to challenge you. Will you debate me tomorrow morning in front of the faculty on the proposition that I will take that ethics are a human construct? And I know that you don't believe that. I don't mind losing. I had one evening. No way I'd say no to that. I mean, what an opportunity. But I had one evening to prepare, and I like playing chess, and debates are somewhat similar. Openings matter. I had several that would work, but I also knew there was a much better way to do it. I had no idea what it was. A real human experience, which you'll all have at some stage. The good Lord does this to me every now and again to remind me who's in charge, because I easily think it's me. And of course it isn't. Anyway, he didn't tell me till I got up from my seat to walk 6 steps to the lectern, and then he demolished the 10 minutes opening that I'd prepared and replaced it with another one, much better. I said to my Canadian Colombian translator, Hugo, what I told you is not what's going to happen. You better pay attention. And he said, fine, this should be fun. He said, it might be for you. I'm not so sure about me, but let's go. And I said, write on the blackboard, this message assembled itself in Spanish. So he did, and I asked the audience, if you come into the lecture room and found this on the blackboard, what would you make of it? You don't normally start debates that way, but you can get away with it when you're a guest. And being Spanish, they get involved. And they said, well, it's sort of quasi-grammatical, but it's nonsense, isn't it? The whole point about messages is someone's trying to get to you. I said, quite right. And I turned around and crossed out message and put DNA in its place. I said, but now you do believe this sentence. This DNA assembled itself. But it's the same sentence. DNA is just message translated into biochemical gobbledygook, and suddenly you believe it. The whole audience burst into applause. I'd won. Because they'd lived under scientific materialism for long enough, they knew it didn't work. And they knew that I was going to take it apart. And that's what happened. After that, I used every year to get, if I could, make sure that my first lecture in my honours biochemistry course, the lecture theatre wasn't in use beforehand, so that I could go in, put that on the board, and turn up a little late and pretend I hadn't seen it, you know. We played this game a bit. They never forgot it, because it's true. And what a message. You know, 3.5 billion personal ID number. Good job we don't have to write it down, you know. It's an astonishing message. And I've lived through this whole process. You know, I was 13 when DNA was first isolated as the helix that it is, the double lovely way that it worked with the complementary strands. I mean, it's so beautiful. And Crick, of course, didn't work that out. He didn't work out that it was a message. It was a physicist in Cambridge at the Cavendish who told him that. And then he pretended he did it. And he thought he'd done it all, you know, and nowhere near. So that was what I call genetic fundamentalism. One gene, one disease. You know, cystic fibrosis, when I was your age, was supposed to be one gene. Now, it's 40. There's one main one, that little zinc gate that doesn't work properly, but all the things around it modify it, so it can be better or worse or whatever. That's the stuff that's going on. And then, how much have you all done some genetics now? And just think for a moment about when I first went into biochemistry as part of my career, my colleagues talked about junk DNA. About 2 or 3% of the DNA was apparently genes as we knew it, and so arrogant were they were prepared to call the rest junk, you know. So I don't think so. Of course, now it's about 2% that isn't junk, you know. I'm sorry, that is junk now. And I doubt if that is too, because even as an act of origami, what God does in the cell, the folding of a protein is unbelievable. I mean, you've got 2 meters of DNA in every cell, if you strip it out apart, and it's folded so you can't see it. Even with the electron microscope, you don't get close. You can only see it biochemically, so to speak. And the fact that you can, if you do it digitally, because it makes this aspect of it clearer, think of them not as GCAT, but as 1, 2, 3, 4. There's lots of DNA now in which you can read it off as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on for about 1,000. You've got a protein. But you can also go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the same sequence. That's absolutely mind-boggling that both should produce functional outcomes. Bill Gates shown that. He shook his head in disbelief. How would you program something like that? God can write. He only needs 4 letters in the alphabet and only needs 3-letter words, and he can do that. If that doesn't give you some sense of awe, I don't know what will. That's what's missing, of course. One of my colleagues, when that came out, and I said, doesn't that really amaze you? He said, oh, it's there. I mean, they're so down to the immediate nitty-gritty that they can't stand back enough to be in awe of what's been done. We win this one. It's not sustainable. Are they teaching you about the sugar code yet? Obviously not. They don't want to.
Sugar.
We may be in doubt about Adam, but we have increasingly little doubt about Eve. Because the formal structure, are you an insect or a mammal or a plant, that's recognizable immediately, and it's contained in a code that's in the ovum, in the outer layer of the ovum. Sugars have more capacity to carry information than DNA does, and it's not susceptible to mutation. They know it's over at that level now. They're suppressing it so far. Stephen Meyer talks about it in Darwin's Doubt. His 2 books are worth having on your shelf if you care about this subject. Don't read the silly evangelical stuff, read the hard stuff. That and Lennox, we win. But there's a lot of work to be done. So I don't know if that helps, but I hope it does a bit. How many of you have not read any John Lennox yet?
John Lennox.
Well, I envy you because it's always nice. I like to think what it would be like to read some of these things for the first time. In fact, I've already told my children I want to go out of this life, if I dement, reading the Narnia stories for the first time every day.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Scripture promises the existence of non-believers until the restoration. How does one argue absolutist morality to a population that does not accept and, according to Calvinism, are guaranteed to reject the very entity that makes Christian morals absolute morals?
Of course, but we won't win that. The punishment for not believing in God is that you are forced to live beyond what your belief system would rationally support. It's a line which Jewish physicians, it stops them in their tracks. Because they often come to grand rounds, and usually the talk I give first if I go to medical school is what Hippocrates knew and we've forgotten. And they've come in and signed the book and got their donut and their coffee and wait for their page to go off and leave. That's the basic structure of the thing. And I will say that the first insight that Hippocrates had was that without transcendence you couldn't trust anyone. Mm-hmm. Or at least, if your doctor believes in judgment after death, will you trust him more than one who doesn't believe that? And then some of these Jews will not be listening very well, and one of them said, "How dare you say that your evangelical friends are better doctors than we are?" And I said, "I didn't say that. I'm glad that you live lives that are better than your belief system can rationally support." Now we have a real discussion. The best argument for this, by the way, and you should collect atheists to speak the truth, is David Stove's Darwinian fairy tales. David Stove was Australia's best analytical philosopher in the last 25 years. He committed suicide when he found he got cancer, which is a rational thing to do if you don't believe there's any meaning in life. But he was a hard rationalist, and he could not tolerate modern neo-Darwinian thought. So Darwinian fairy tales is the consequence. Beautifully written. I mean, he has a pen dipped in a mixture of elegance and venom. It's a wonderful combination. The chapter title is enough to make you want to read the book. The Horse in the Bathroom, Tax and the Single Girl are a couple of chapters. But the basic point he's making is that you cannot derive individual altruism from a Darwinian model. It is rationally impossible, which is true. If it's a battle of the genes, then you cannot have anything beyond group altruism. What you got taught in altruism was Willie Hamilton's rubbish. I mean, he got obituaries in Nature and Science because of it, because he got them off the hook to a degree, as long as people didn't read what he'd actually written, and he mixed it up in some fancy mathematics which weren't required. But if, for his model to work, if somebody commits suicide jumping off a bridge, before you jump in to save them, you have to do a swift calculus of how many shared genes you have. But you don't do that. You grab a child who runs in front of the bus, you don't ask whether it's my child, my grandchild, or whatever. No. Because according to Willie Hamilton, the more shared genes you have, the more altruistic you are. It may be a nice mathematical theory, but it doesn't describe human behavior. And there is no Darwinian, what's the word I want? Darwinian sensitive morality. You can't get it. There is none in the animal kingdom. You know, I live on a farm and raise Hereford cattle. Those calves know the rules. There's no compassion in that system. There's none of those things. The biggest gets the food first. The others wait patiently for their turn. That's the way it is. So don't argue the bits that are problematic. You've got plenty of good stuff to go for. I mean, does it matter to you or me whether God used evolutionary processes as part of the way he built the world? He invented modular design, not us. And he uses them in different places. And would your car be more or less well designed if it changed according to the seasons or the weather or any other physical characteristic? No. Anybody who denies microevolution is simply ignorant. I mean, there's plenty of examples now of microevolution. There's no question about that. But macro? No, there's no reason to say I must be bullied into that. It's not even a reasonable hypothesis anymore. So it's over. But you can't yet say it in medicine. You can say it in physics. Molecular biology is on the way. I mean, Francis Collins' lab was what's the word I want? Cause célèbre. But he didn't do any evangelism. I mean, he didn't become a Christian himself till his 30s because of biochemistry. That's what led him there. But all he had to do was look over the shoulders of the guys working in his lab and say, wow, isn't that amazing? You don't need to do anything on that. He's a good guy. Does that
Yeah,
help
thank
with
you.
it?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Okay. There's two more to go. How
Oh, I might get through.
How should we, as Christian physicians, view topics such as assisted suicide? How do we decide if life is too painful or not worth continuing? Also, will believers who commit suicide go to hell?
I don't know the answer to the last one, so I won't answer it. Certainly, if it's due to depression, I think not. The evidence for that being a disease exactly analogous to diabetes is overwhelming. And I treat it as a disease. My first climbing partner was one of the most wonderful Christian guys I've ever met. He was so charitable. He only had the clothes he stood up with and a change. He said anything more than that in this world is not defensible. He'd give it away to people poorer than he was. And he was a lovely climbing partner. And then I qualified in medicine, and they work you too hard. And he developed an acute depression, and he got into the hands of people who said, you just need to pray about it.
No.
And he committed suicide. Even in his suicide, he went to the far end of the railway track, you know, near the final points, the electric system in London, and put his head on the line. He didn't want to disrupt the system. And his note said, I've lost Jesus. Nothing is worth living. He hadn't lost Jesus. He was depressed. So I'm sure he's not going to hell. I love that line, that text. I am not like you. I love mercy. We don't know how big mercy is yet. I think we'll find it's a lot bigger than we think it is. I hope so. I hope that hell will be largely empty. We'll see. But the thing we're promised is that we will be at ease with what comes because we will see its rightness. So the first bit was more what that was.
How should we, as physicians,
view the care? We have a lot to do here. The bottom line is when you do things for patients who have entered upon their dying other than care, that is intrusive and meddlesome medicine. Got it?
Easy.
When a patient has entered upon their dying, anything other than care is intrusive and meddlesome medicine. The art form is to know when you've reached that stage. Now, of course, if you don't believe in anything other than this life, you may want to hold on to the very last minute. But for Christians, I mean, I think about this. I'm statistically a lot closer to that than you are. I want to die at home in my own bed where my friends and others can gather around, and my dying can be a form of evangelism.
Mm.
And it can be. It took a lot of things to get me from my materialist, ambitious, selfish life. And one of the key things was a young man. When I came back from the Caribbean and took a job in 1980 in Ottawa, cross the point between biochemistry and pediatrics. Primarily biochemistry and cell physiology, because that's what brought the money in, which is what the dean had hired me for. So, they wanted to make more connection between biochemistry and medicine, and that's not easy to do. So the pediatrician said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I want to do nutrition." They said, "Dietitians do that." And I said, "That's exactly the problem, but you'll have to wait to see what I think nutrition is and what they think nutrition is. But I've got to get my lab set up first." But there was one guy, a gastroenterologist, who was interested in what I'd done. I'd been making children grow at 25 times the normal rate for age. We could double a child's weight in 40 days, 10-pound 2-year-old. And this guy said, "What are you going to do here?" I said, "Well, I know, I never thought about it until I went to Jamaica, but there's malnutrition here too. But you find me a child who's lost a documented 5 kilograms of weight and has a functional gut. That's all I need. I don't care what the diagnosis is, just those 2 things." A few months later, he called me and said, "I've got your patient." And that was wonderful. It worked. Then I actually put 10 kilograms of lean tissue on in 10 days. That was grand rounds, and I had no problems after that. So then I went for the bigger fish, which was cystic fibrosis. Was the commonest genetic disorder. You may not even be there by the time some of you qualify, because it's being destroyed by eugenic abortion, has been for some time. But when I looked at them with the eyes I'd acquired in Jamaica, I realized that most children with CF 30 years ago actually were malnourished at death. They weren't World Vision pictures. I mean, World Vision takes 0.5% of the malnutrition load, kwashiorkor, with the flaky paint skin and the edema. That's the rarest form of malnutrition. They're basically manipulating the public, and I don't like that. But children here get properly fed. The problem with CF is they can't eat enough, particularly given their infections. So they were malnourished. I quickly established that, and then I jumped through the hoops and got permission to see, A, could I reverse it, and B, was it worth doing? The first volunteer was a 15-year-old boy with a body mass of an 11-year-old. I mean, to talk about informed consent, you have to be a very clever academic to be so stupid. I mean, any boy of 15 who looks like an 11-year-old will do anything on this God's earth to get some muscle. He came and volunteered. I said, "I haven't even told you what I want to do." He said, "I don't care what it is, I'll do it." He was a farmer's son. He couldn't lift a small bale. He went out in the barn to cough. And I wanted to give him some muscle. And I said, "But Stephen, I will have to feed you through a tube through your nose into your stomach, and given your cough, I need a month. You will probably cough it up over 200 times. Can you handle that?" He said yes. And he did. We became friends very quickly. We both liked Monty Python. So we only needed a phrase to complete the sketch, you know. And halfway through the month, the nurses called and said, "Stephen's just coughed up his tube again." And we have so many admissions. It was a Sunday, lunchtime. "If you want your protocol followed, we won't put the tube back till 7 o'clock tonight. You'll have to come and put it in yourself." I said, "Fine." I drove to the hospital. It was only 7 minutes from my home anyway. And I got to his bed, and I was wearing a suit, which I don't normally do. And he said, "Oh, you go to church?" I said, "Yes, do you?" And it turned out he was Catholic, I was Protestant. I said no more. We're not the Bible Belt up there in the northeast. Any talk about religion is verboten. I had actually talked about faith for over 20 years. So I put in the tube and went home. But his amazing mother said to me, I met her in the corridor the next week, and she said, "You had an opportunity on Sunday to talk to Stephen about faith. You would do that very well." She had no evidence for that statement. I suppose it's an act of prophecy if you're a Pentecostal. I don't know what to call it to this day. But of course I didn't take any notice. Stephen got 600 grams, not 6 kilos. But we had enough to see that this was doable. We had some, teething troubles to get over. To cut a long story short, we put the first permanent feeding tube into a CF child in Ottawa 30 years ago. It's when you get to a CF clinic, if you lift the shirts, you'll find 15, if it's a decent clinic, 15-20% of the kids will have what looks at first sight like a little plastic button. It's actually an entrance to the gut. And you can give them an extra 1,500 calories at night when they can take it, which is not all the time. We worked it all out, and it worked very well. But it was too late for Stephen. And about 4 years later, I was called to go to his room. And when I got to his room, he was dying. His mum was sitting by the bed. He'd been there for a few hours. You're lucky if your CO2 is going up. You just have a mild headache and you fade away. And you don't want to be alone, but you don't want to talk. But when I came in, he said, "Good, sit down. I want to talk to you." We were well past doctor-patient relationship in a normal way. And he said, "It says in the Bible, if you ask anything in my name, I'll give it to you. I'm 19 and I'm dying and I don't want to. What do you say?" Now, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible, but he was a friend. That wasn't an option. I tried the professorial escape route. "Stephen, that's a difficult question. It will take a little while." And I got a lovely Monty Python answer, just a whisper of a smile. "I have a little while." Both he and I knew his life was measured in hours at that point. And so I had to work my way through the creeds. Because he was Catholic, I was Anglican, though we had that in common. And of course, he didn't help. He believed it all. He believed Jesus was the Son of God. He believed he came to die for our sins. If we confess our sins, we're forgiven. When we die, we go to heaven. But it wasn't helping. He was not ready to die. Now, there's one prayer you will always be able to pray and never be ashamed to do it. It's called help. It's answered very quickly, almost invariably. I said, "Lord, I need help. You know I need help." Not out loud, of course. And into my head he inserted an American writer, Annie Dillard. Any of you read any Annie Dillard? No Annie Dillard. No. Oh, well, it's worth coming. You've got another. Annie Dillard lived a disordered life and then got saved. And she writes superbly. The book was Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek. It turned out it was a footnote. She said, "Oh yes, God will provide for all your needs, but do read the small print." He decides what your needs are, not you. And I knew what to say. I'd already pointed out that by this time, there were children who could run on that ward who wouldn't have had the energy to walk. Little boys were still managing to skate for a minute with their friends, wouldn't have been able to put their skates on. He'd added at least 5 to 10 years of life to these kids. He'd done a lot, and I pointed out to him how much he'd done, that in his short life he'd made a greater contribution to the general good than most of us will do in a lifetime. I said to him, "Stephen, I think God is saying something like this to you. Stephen, you have done all that I want you to do. You've coughed enough. It's time to come home. Both you and I know that you're going to die in the next few hours, unless there's a miracle. Because God is at least permissively involved in that, it must be for your good." Can you believe that? His mom didn't say a word. This took about half an hour. His mom didn't say a word the whole time. She was praying. And he looked up and said, "Thank you, that helps. I think I can." I wasn't there, but he died a few hours later, very peacefully. But his mom, his amazing mum, had not finished with me. She was going to lose 3 children to CF. She didn't have a normal child. And she wrote me a note. And I lost it for years, and just about 6 months ago it fell out of a book. And she said, it was ironic, I'm making the English a little bit more sophisticated than it was, but she said, "It was ironic you were not allowed to give Stephen food for his body. But thank God you were there when he needed food for his soul. He had been asking his doctor, his priest, his family that question, and everybody had pushed it away till I came along." Now, it wasn't for Stephen, was it? In 3 hours, Stephen had an even better answer than mine, by a long way. But for his mum, it was very important that he die well, which he did. She was going to go through that 3 times. And for me, it was a huge guilt trip. I hadn't had a conversation like that for over 20 years. And I had to repent. Because only if a senior professor like myself in a liberal environment would do that openly, and they wouldn't take me on, they never did, would it become easier for students to do it. We have something to say when patients are dying. They don't. And so you need to learn how to do it. Diane Comp is a book you have to have on your shelf. A Window on Heaven. How many people have read that one? No? Well, it's worth me coming. I've sold a few books. I don't get any royalties though. But Diane, I call her a friend and colleague. She, like me, grew up in a Bible-believing home, a good evangelical background. We both went off to university. I was ambitious, flirted with Marxism and the sins of the flesh. She didn't do any of those things. She became an existentialist, so that's much worse. You can be cured of the other 3 by the realities that go along with them. But existentialism is one way of coping with life. Life has no ultimate meaning, so you do what gives you pleasure. Now, Diane, she wouldn't mind me saying this, extremely smart. So smart that she's intimidating to most men, and not beautiful. So she was realistic. She knew she wasn't going to get married, but she loved children. So she did pediatrics. But rather foolishly, she ended up doing oncology. Now, pediatric oncology and existentialism, they don't go together very well. What does an existentialist oncologist say to a dying patient? You're one, not the existentialist, but there's nothing to say. The only honest thing would, this is absurd, I'm glad it's you and not me. That would be honest, but neither kind nor helpful. And for no good reason except her upbringing, Diane was kind and helpful. But her mother kept turning up at the back of her head saying, Diane, you ought to be there when they died. She handed it over to the social workers. She did what many doctors do. When they start to die, I don't go to bed anymore. Shouldn't do that. But in the end, she gave in to her conscience. And the first child she sat with was a little girl, 8, I think, dying of leukemia. Fading away in a final coma, Diane and the parents sitting by the bed. Now, the great thing about pediatrics as opposed to adult medicine is the frequency of lucid intervals before death is not rare. And this little girl sat up in bed and said, Mummy, can you see the angels? Can you hear their singing? It's beautiful. And she was gone, just like that. She wasn't worried about dying, she just wanted to get there. And Mum and Dad, of course, are Christian. And it was a huge help in their bereavement. Diane, it took 2 more children to bring her to faith. And I won't spoil the book for you, except as she said, it was exactly what an arrogant Yale professor needed.
Wow.
It's got God's irony written all over it. It changed her life. And it's, whenever you see a second-hand copy, pick it up, put it on the shelf, and you'll give it away in due course.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, we got a last one here. In light of the news about successful generation and birth of genetically edited babies in China, how should Christians view the topic of genetic modification of human beings? There's a lot of potential to treat or cure devastating genetic diseases, but with the necessary loss and destruction of countless human embryos in the testing process. With the future of gene editing, where is the line in between curing horrific genetic diseases and eugenics?
There is no line, is there? I mean, it's a continuum. I think the first thing you have to start talking about, because it will determine how far you can go in the discussion, and that is moral consequence important to society as a whole? Think about that for a moment, because there are consequences to everything you do. You all accept physical consequence. When you jump off a skyscraper, you're dead when you hit the concrete. The moral consequence is exactly the same. If you start using lies to evade reality, you become a liar, and that deforms your character. Common in presidents. And it's a problem. So you can't just look at doing things without putting it into a bigger context. I mean, we've done that before, the famous quote by Oppenheimer, when you see something cool, you do it, and it was the atomic bomb. Now, there's a long discussion there about how many people would have died if he hadn't used it, etc., etc. But the world has changed by using it. The amount of anxiety and everything else has changed permanently, and it always does. For those of you who are very Pentecostal, remember that everybody Jesus healed did one thing, right? They died. That's the human condition. So now you begin to see, I hope already, that there are two very distinctly different ways of thinking your way through this process. Now, I had, as I said earlier, the last clinic I ran was for severely disabled children, mainly with complex metabolic disorders, but also a lot of cerebral palsy, severe cerebral palsy. And that clinic, I was in great doubt at the end of the day as to who the patient was. It was usually me. Now, most of these children, they are not upset if we make them comfortable. This is the only life they have. Even the CF kids, they said, of course, I wouldn't wish to have CF, but I don't want to be dead. They love their lives, even though from our point, it's us that says their life is not worth living, not them.
That's right. That's right.
Now, the Middle Ages are much wiser than us. You know what they said, and particularly the mentally disabled? That they are closer to God than we are, because they don't carry a grudge into tomorrow. That's what Down syndrome children are a particular example of this. They do not carry grudges. Most children with severe disability don't carry grudges into the next day. I had one quadriplegic child, Denis Deneau, from Quebec. He had the most seraphic smile you can imagine. Nurses would change their route round the ward just to stop for a moment at his cot and get a smile, because it was angelic. Now, Quebec is very generous with social services, and both his parents stopped work to care for Denis, because if you have a high quadriplegia, there's usually only one or two people who can feed you at all, and it takes hours. They wouldn't let me put a permanent feeding tube to bypass the problem, which is what I did in most patients. But whenever he stopped smiling, it meant that he was malnourished. And then they'd come in and let me feed him by tube until he got his smile back, and then they'd tell you where, till he lost it again. I was just the smile replacement doctor. I wasn't allowed to deal with anything more. But the stories are just so beautiful. And our world is going to be so much less compassionate as we go along the line, because it progressively, well, you see it already, you are being pushed, especially girls, into particular models of perfection. I really feel sorry for girls. They've had their childhood ripped away from them. I mean, at what age does a little girl's clothes become sexually important, so to speak? It is horrendous what's happening. They have no childhood anymore, many of them. This is a big problem. I mean, 30 years ago, menarche occurred at about, on average, 15 years of age. Now we don't diagnose it after the age of 8. Now, 8 is too young, isn't it? What's it due to? That's a good question. I think it's got a lot to do with the pill, because when water is cleaned up, it doesn't get rid of the estrogen. Men are being feminized, their sperm rates are dropping, there are fishes that are not going male. We're paying a price for other technological solutions to moral problems. And that's what's going on here. When God brings these things into the world, the people who are on the suffering end, they're fascinating people to talk to. Now, a severely handicapped child can make or break a family. It doesn't usually leave you unaffected in the middle. But those that are made are extraordinary people. And Stephen's mum said to me years later, she said, if God had told me what he wanted me to do in the beginning, I said, I couldn't do that. But I've done it, and it's all right. And she runs the CF chapter now. That's what we're lacking most in our societies. People have moral fortitude that acknowledge that that fortitude comes from Christ and not from themselves. We had a very shallow philosophy of suffering. But that's not to say there aren't problems. The biggest one, I think, that's going to come up fairly shortly is the change that's occurring in the muscular dystrophies. Because in the past, before computers came along, children with those dystrophies were ready to die by the time they couldn't move anything. Now? Oh no. Because with a computer, it's amazing what they can do. One of the guys working on this in Philadelphia I met, and all his illustrations for his talks are done by the kids with dystrophy. And they know exactly where he is, and they keep up to date with every move he makes. Computers have transformed their lives, but they all want to go on respirators now. We can't afford it, or we say we can't. We're going to have to choose what matters most. He had a lovely kid. This kid can so good on computers. He actually got a. He developed an agency chasing down debtors, a debt collection agency. And he loved when he tracked them down. He got an artificial voice. He'd call them up and he says, "I know where you are. And if you don't pay up, I'm going to come and break every bone in your body." He can only move his eyelids. But I don't know how we're going to deal with these things, but I know we need to get first things first. And a higher view of the sovereignty of God is part of that. I suspect you, for instance, you will be told that if you will not have genetic testing in utero and you get a handicapped child, the bill's on you. The state won't pick it up because you brought it on yourself. Of course, they'll pay for the effects of total sexual disarray. That's not your own fault, of course, but it will be your own fault if you have a handicapped child. So there's a lot more at stake here than you see at the beginning. Your job is to educate your churches for a start. We ought to do a lot more in this direction. I know one or two places that do it well. The one thing that parents with disabled children need is respite. They love their children, but they need a weekend off every now and again. That's something that Christians should be doing. And of course, when you start doing that, you know the best time to do it? When you've got teenagers getting out of order. Have a handicapped child in the family for a long weekend. It's amazing what it does to them. If I had my way, juvenile delinquents would have to care for the disabled children. They would be civilized by the process. Certainly those children civilized me. And the stories are endless. I'll finish with one. I mean, I don't know what time it is, but you're still listening, so it's your fault. We also put the first feeding tubes into high quadriplegics. It's amazing when you start taking serious ethical positions, God does things. I realised that some of the things I'd done in Jamaica when I studied Paul Ramsey a bit more, I had been guilty of instrumentalising the children to a degree. I didn't do anything that was dangerous to them, although their mothers might have thought so if they'd seen me taking 5 mils of blood out of the jugular vein of a malnourished child. But that's a different matter. It wasn't dangerous in my hands, and it led to a lot of good results. But I decided when I got to Canada that there had to be potential good for every child I worked with, and that made me have to be much more careful. Anyway. Breaking the HIPAA rules, which fortunately don't apply in Canada. Hillary's horrendous invention. You're not allowed to discuss patients in the cafeteria in the US. It's a serious crime. I don't know how many problems have been solved for patients in my lifetime alone by speaking in the corridor or in the cafeteria. I can think of at least 6 lives I've saved because of those complications, doing that, which is illegal in the States now. The privacy of the elite is more important than the life of the obs, basically, the deplorables, as she called them. But anyway, I was talking to an orthopedic surgeon in Children's Hospital cafeteria, and I think pediatric, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but pediatric orthopedic guys are really very nice guys on the whole. They're nicer than most of the other docs. I don't know what it is about them, but there's something about them. Anyway, Bill was one of those, and he was fascinated by what I'd been doing in the Caribbean, and I knew that he did the surgery on people with lots of, had to have releases so that they could be nursed, and not easy work to do. And I said, you know, interestingly, in your area, we occasionally got a child that we thought was malnourished because it was secondary to palsy of some sort, because it felt as though they were a bit stiff. But it was gone when we brought them back to normal. It was so interesting, in fact, the next one we found, we did a few muscle biopsies. Again, probably too instrumental. But we were astonished to find that a severely malnourished child has empty myotubes. They've eaten all the inside of the unnecessary muscles. And then when we refed them 6 weeks later, those myotubes were full of glycogen. And 6 weeks after that, they were normal muscle fibers again. So a 2-year-old can go down to empty myotubes and come all the way back up again. And he said, you better go and see Anjanette. And he sent me up to see a little girl with cerebral palsy who was in and out of a hospital all the while with infections. ID gave the antibiotics, and she went out and came back again, and she was so angry with life she'd bitten off the anterior third of her tongue and had to wear a cup to stop her doing that. But she was malnourished. And I went back to Bill and said, she's malnourished. I'd love to see whether I can reverse it and whether it's worth doing. Well, both turned out to be true. Then I went and looked at the literature, and I put malnutrition, cerebral palsy in. This was before computers were freely available to us. Had to go to the library to do those kinds of searches. I did a dozen searches. Zero, nothing. There was no literature. Nobody had ever tried to quantify the efficiency of feeding in a CP child. And then got into it as well. I was reviewing a grant for the Medical Research Council, and it was a Swiss lady, professor in McGill, rather boring, good work, but rather boringly applied, trying to measure the efficiency of feeding, but not in interesting conditions. So I made sure she got her grant, and then called her and said, this is off the record, but you're going to get your grant. I made sure of that, but now you owe me. I want you to come and look at my children. And we ended up writing several papers together, and because it turned out that if you have a high quadriplegia, your swallowing efficiency drops to 10% of normal. Now you eat for an hour a day, roughly. So if you've got 10% efficiency, you need 10 hours a day to get your nutrients. It can't be done. I then went looking, and I found 20 teenagers weighing less than 40 pounds being well looked after in long stay homes because they were trying to do it the only way they could, and that's the best they could do. That would not have come my way at all if I hadn't tried to do the way the Lord would imply we should do it. We're making judgments that we shouldn't make, aren't we? It's not wrong to do GMO in food, by the way. We do it normally by breeding. I mean, it's no different. The animals next door to me in the dairy, if you let those loose in the forest, they would die a horrendous death within 48 hours. Once we breed animals for our purposes, they are dependent upon us in most cases. You know that all the breeds of dogs we've made, they're much more disease prone than a mongrel. I would never buy a breed. You know, I need a new dog around the farm, it's a mongrel because they're healthier. But we don't think that's wrong. And then we get all fussed about GMO seeds. Now, there's some things you could say about that. I don't like Monsanto, but they've been taken over by Bayer, which will probably make it worse. I don't know, we'll see. But we're not thinking about these things very clearly. So, to finish with, what are you going to do about that? because I want you to keep your faith intact. And so this is a shameless plug for the college. We've had several actually medical students from here take a break and come and take a year off and do the course with us. And Jenny Holmes, who now has a lovely job at Johns Hopkins, was one of your best students. But we keep it on the website. And she wrote, "I've had 12 years of higher education, but nothing came close to this year." And that's true. And the Lloyd twins, they came from here. And there's one other, I've forgotten the name of the guy who ended up as chief resident. He didn't do our course at Chicago.
John Yoon.
John Yoon, that's right, yeah.
And there's another one that's in Kansas, still in family medicine.
Who came from Southwestern? I missed that, yeah.
Yeah.
About 10% of the people who've taken the course end up in medicine. We also, if you're looking for a spouse, your probability of getting married is 10%. And what's nice about it, I love it. I look around every year and say, who is it this year? I never get it right. A really lovely example a couple of years ago, I was speaking at the Ravi Zacharias conference in Toronto, and Ravi's Canadian executive secretary came up afterwards and said, "I'm going to come and do your course." I said, "Oh yeah, you're going to leave Ravi to come to our little program?" She said, "Yes, I am." And she did. She was in her late 20s, and that year, most of the students are bridged between home Christian schools and university, but there's always 2 or 3. We've had people come back with doctorates to do our course. So it's worth doing. And we've had MDs come back. We've had 3 of those. Anyway, that particular year, as well as Brittany, who'd been with Ravi, there was a guy who had heard me in the Fraser Valley in a big apologetics conference. So I didn't know he was there, but he got a good job in IT, but God was telling him, "I want you to do some other things." And he listened to me and he said, "Oh, I'm going to do that course." So he turned up. And there was another one who got a degree in music. So those 3 obviously bonded. They enjoyed one another as people who were thinking and wanting to be better Christians. And then this time, just after Christmas, they all went away for Christmas and they came back. And Steve said to Brittany, she said, "I want to say something to you. And you can say stop and I won't say any more. But I want to tell you that I think I thought about you every day during the Christmas break." And she smiled and said, "I thought about you too." They're married with a baby now. Could there be a better way of finding a spouse, actually, where you enjoy your future spouse's commitment as a Christian and their mind before you even think about bodies? It's a good way to go. Now, what else can you do? How many of you do not have a support group that calls you every week? Do not have, note I said. That means all the rest of you have a support group? Well, that's amazing.
Wow, that's amazing.
But you need a support group that truly knows and loves the Lord. Mm-hmm. And you want them to call you every week and ask you, "Have you read the scriptures this week? Have you prayed? Have you just lied to me?" Then they can read to you and pray for you over the phone. Because you will go through a period of being totally flat in most cases. Almost every doctor does, not all, but almost all. We go for at least weeks, often months, and if you're academic, it will be years. In my case, it was nearly 20. It's a training program. It's called the Dark Nights of the Soul. God does it to lots of people. You're not alone. You can prepare for it when you stop reading scriptures, which you will sometime in the next few years, usually because of sheer exhaustion. Which will be the last part of the Bible that you read before you give up on it for a while? No. That's hope, that's almost like, committing suicide, isn't it?
Part of the Bible that you would.
Which bit of the Bible do you go on reading for the longest? No, because you're evangelicals, that's the trouble, you don't read the Psalms. And do this experiment, and if you do it for 3 weeks, you won't stop. When you wake up in the morning, say the Lord's Prayer twice, once by rote, and secondly, Ask God to stop you somewhere in the Lord's Prayer, and you use that during the day. When you get a vacant patch, instead of daydreaming or fantasizing, you go back to that phrase, and that will save you lots of time and keep you on track. But read a psalm every day before you get out of bed, or as soon as you got out of bed, as soon as it's convenient and comfortable to do it. And if you read a psalm a day, obviously 119 you break up, but some days so you can read 2. You're going to go through the psalms twice a year. That means very shortly you will know where to go on a very bad day. You will have very bad days. There's even a verse that was written centuries ago for residents. It reads like this: I have become like a dried up old wineskin in the smoke. When will you punish those attendings who are punishing me? Obviously I've added a word, but I've done nothing to the meaning. That's in Psalm 119, about 86, somewhere around there. There are at least 6 psalms that begin in gloom and end in gloom. So at least you know you're not alone. And the guy who was there before you, he wrote a psalm afterwards, so maybe you'll recover too. In other words, it tells you this is normal. It's part of the training program. If God takes you seriously, he's toughening you up. But you can only do that if you already know the Psalms well enough to know where to go on a particular day. So once you make the Psalms part of your regular prayer and meditation, replace some of the supermarket prayers. Lord, give me this, this, and this. What's on special this week? You don't need that prayer. Because ultimately there's only one prayer, thy will be done. And that will help you. Next, keep the Sabbath, not legalistically.
Amen. Amen.
Jeremiah 17, if you will keep my law, then princes will enter Jerusalem. What's he saying? He's saying that if you keep the Sabbath law and put down all your burdens for one day a week, you're practicing being a prince, or if you're sexist, a princess. I mean, you're learning that you're royalty in the long run. That's what he wants you to do. If you can't get through medical school without working 7 days a week, you should get out of medical school now, because you're making a whip to beat your own back with. God has made people for every job on earth that needs to be done. And if you're in the job that he wants you to do, it's perfectly compatible with keeping his commandments for how you ought to live. If you have a day off every week, you'll come back the next day fresh, and your learning will be so much more efficient than it would be otherwise. I see people, sadly Asian families are the worst offenders. They drive their children, and the girls are most dutiful, they get hammered the most. And they often don't get through residency because they do nothing but study. They're utterly boring, and they're depressed, and they're not allowed to live. That won't do. It's not what God wants. And it's a disaster. Whereas if you're made to do the job, medicine's not actually difficult. I mean, it's not an intellectually demanding activity by and large. You shouldn't be worried about it too much. And if you are, there's a problem. And maybe you're not made for it. Did you actually check out with God that he wanted you to do this? I mean, the people God makes, you wouldn't want to be them. No one would want to be married to Newton. But my goodness, he could work in a way that nobody else ever will again. And that's true to this day. I mean, my son is like me in very much the same way. And I'm so glad that it's such a gift to be free in that sense. But he took about 7 years to accept that God had given him talent. I took even longer. Believe it or not, I know it's an insult to the giver now, but I denied that I had any ability to teach that was anything out of the ordinary. Now, that's not defensible before the giver, is it? Not looking forward to saying how much I'm sorry for what I did. Actually, it was an Asian student, an Asian professor who actually nailed me to the ground in the end and made me accept. Because I used to walk in to teach you guys in medical school, and I just gave the lecture and walked out, and I didn't care whether you understood it or not. After all, it was biochemistry, you weren't going to remember it anyway. And then they gave me a teaching award. And this Chinese professor, he was a very good guy actually, he said, how long do you actually spend preparing undergraduate lectures? And I flippantly said, well, 20 minutes is a bit excessive, isn't it? and he said, you're not joking, are you? I said, no. He said, it's so unfair. I spend hours on it, and they trash me, and you walk in and walk out, and they give you an award. I didn't deserve it. I said, I didn't ask for it, they gave it to me. Yeah. But that's what happens. When God makes you to do something, it's not a problem. You know, I was doing 400 lectures a year at one point. I'm in my 80th year, and I'm still doing 200 lectures a year. That's God's grace, isn't it? You may not enjoy me, but I've enjoyed you tonight. But you're meant to enjoy life. That's one of the things that we should be. Happy. Not in a mindless way, but deeply happy. The happiest summer of my life was 1995. That was the first time, don't wait as long as that, I was 55. That was the first time I gave a summer to God. You probably do good things already, Christian things, but you probably decide what they are, right? Go the next step. Let God decide what they are. Now, we went to Africa because of my work, and we had a program running on the edge of Rwanda, in Zaire. In 1994, the Rwanda War blew up. We were actually doing an 8-day walk through the Itumbi Mountains at that point. But we had a shortwave radio. And Sally was on the border of World Relief Canada, so as soon as we got back, she went up to see what was happening. She was on the bridge in Goma with my 17-year-old son as the refugees began to flow across. She actually got herself on the wrong side of the bridge when they closed it in Rwanda. She got out. Well, there were sleeping people on either side of it, trying to swim the river. She bribed her way out. My son, who I didn't know then was a mathematician, was watching the NGOs and seeing how stupid they were from his point of view. They had no understanding of numbers at all, and you need them when you've got masses of refugees coming. Anyway, at the end of that summer, he came back with me, but I knew that Sally was not going to come back because there were 7-year-olds trying to care for 4-year-olds. It was total chaos, and she won't run away from children. No reason to come back. Jonathan was going to university. Everybody else was out of the home. There's only me. I could look after myself. I didn't see her for 2 years, except briefly, twice a year. She came home at Christmas, and we all heaved a sigh of relief when she got on the plane back, because she co-opted everybody's agenda to raise money for her projects, and then when we raised the money for her, we could breathe again. I went out in the summer to see her again. There was no email in 1994 in the centre, so we literally had no contact. But God had prepared us amazingly. Just before this happened, we were travelling in Zaire, and you should never travel at night, there's no law, but we had a breakdown. So we were on the road late at night, after midnight, and there'd been some murders on that road the week before, and we were stopped by a drunken soldier with a Kalashnikov, and he got us out of the truck. My wife, my son, myself, and a couple of Africans. And he made a big mistake. He didn't shoot us immediately, obviously. And after a few minutes, I said to my son, Jonathan, "Are you afraid?" He said, "No, I'm not." Isn't that strange? I said, "Neither am I, neither is your mother." And he knows that, and it's really worrying him. That they respect strength of spirit. And then out of nowhere, a senior officer in the army appeared who wasn't drunk, and we were free. He said, "What on earth was that about?" But what God had taught us is that there's no reason to fear.
That's right.
And we were not going to have any contact with one another for over 6 months at a time. Neither of us were afraid at any point. So we weren't courageous, because courage is overcoming fear. Didn't have any. Now, Sally ended up running 4 or 5 refugee camps. 4, I think it was. I went out in the summer of 95 to see her. Now, my research in the area was in ruins, wrecked by the war and everything else. So I said to God, for the first time in my life, I've got nothing to do this summer. If you've got anything for me to do, I'll be glad to do it. And he took me seriously. I ended up teaching in the refugee camps for between 3 and 6 hours a day, every other day for 2 months. I was in tears, they were in tears, and I was simultaneously the happiest man in the world. You've all seen Chariots of Fire, haven't you? You remember when Eric is late for Sunday school because he's running too much? And Jenny thinks he's losing his faith and he won't be a missionary in China. And he takes her and puts his hands on his shoulders and he says, Jenny, I haven't forgotten about China. But God made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. Well, God made me articulate. I had denied it till that summer. I gave the gift back and I felt his pleasure, subjectively. It's absolutely addictive in the very best way. So don't wait too long. Don't spend 40 years to getting to what you can get to when you're 25 or earlier. Go in peace.